Hello, everyone, and welcome to this virtual meeting of the Commonwealth Club, featuring investigative journalist Barton Gellman in conversation with Anne Kornblut, head of global curation at Facebook. I'm Mark Zitter, chair of the Zetema Project and a member of the club's board of governors. It's a pleasure to introduce today's program. As you may know, in the Bay Area, the Commonwealth Club has suspended its in-person programming, but we've substituted a wonderful collection of virtual programs such as this one. There are many others, and you can learn about them by going to the club's website, commonwealthclub.org. We are a nonprofit organization and would appreciate any financial support if you'd like to donate to the club to support this kind of programming. If you wish to do so, please text the word donate to 415-329-4231 or to the club's website, and we will post that phone number on the site on this program as we go along too. Please also share or like this program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Okay, let's get to the program. Today we have a program featuring Barton Gellman. He's an investigative reporter, a writer for the Washington Post, and the author of the new book, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. It's particularly relevant at this time when we're discussing societal injustice and the authority of law enforcement. While a reporter at the Washington Post, Barton Gellman was one of 3 journalists that Edward Snowden, the CIA contractor who copied and leaked highly classified information from the National Security Agency, picked to review this vast and explosive cache of files. These files revealed the extent of the American government's access to our every communication. Mr. Gellman and his 2 colleagues shared the Pulitzer Prize for their work. And that's the part of the story that you may be familiar with. There is more, and that was only the beginning for Mr. Gellman. He went on to dig deeper into both the U.S. surveillance state and Snowden's own complicated history. As he sought the truth, Mr. Gellman himself was harassed with legal threats, government investigations, and foreign intelligence agencies intent on stealing his own files and thwarting his efforts. So today we'll get a detailed look at Edward Snowden, learn about America's surveillance state, both now and post-COVID, and we'll hear Mr. Gellman's own account of his personal cloak and dagger experience being surveilled by unknown adversaries. Barton Gellman will be in conversation with Anne Kornblut, head of global curation at Facebook and the former associate editor of the Washington Post, where she oversaw, among other things, national security issues. And in fact, she features in the story and is in the book. So we're very pleased to have them both. Please help me welcome Barton Gellman and Anne Kornblut.
Hi, thank you so much. And hi, Bart. It's so good to see you again, even in this format. Congratulations. I have to start by congratulating you on this spectacular book. I lived alongside some of this with you at the Post, and I was wondering what more I could learn from it, and I have been blown away by the details and the compelling narrative. So congratulations. It's amazing to think back that when this all began, when you were just starting to get a feel for what you had, that how much was unknown. And so I want to start by asking you to go back to the beginning. Take us back to the beginning. How did you first learn that Edward Snowden had a story to tell and that he wanted you to tell it?
I first learned quite indirectly because Laura Poitras, the filmmaker, she and I had been fellows together at NYU, and the US government had a habit of stopping her at the border every time she crossed and searching her belongings, searching her computers, imaging her storage devices. And she came to me for advice about how to encrypt so that she could defend herself against this. Laura's travails were written about, and Edward Snowden read it, and he approached her in the guise of an anonymous handle called Verax, or truth teller in Latin. I had to look that up. And Laura came to me and said, someone has come to me claiming to be a member of the intelligence community and having a big, big story. Help me figure this out. Is it real?
So before we go any further, I want to encourage people who are listening to please send in questions. You obviously then did get involved with working with Laura Poitras, and I want to talk about the surveillance of journalists. You get into this quite a bit in the book when you learn about some of the surveillance that had been done on you. But I want you to bring us into that moment. When did you first communicate with Snowden directly?
The first time I had direct communication with Snowden was in the very early spring of 2013. Virax appeared in my inbox. We were taking considerable pains to keep our communications on the QT. So we both were using burner laptops and anonymous communication channels and encrypted conversations. So it looked like just nonsense crossing the internet, and it looked like it could have come from anywhere. And he started to answer my questions and ask a lot of questions of his own. He was afraid that he couldn't trust me to publish, that the Washington Post or I would chicken out if the government asked us not to write these stories. I was trying to figure out whether he was a crazy person, a fraud, an insider with a grievance, or whether this was legit. And so I asked many, many dozens of questions before I ever saw the first document.
Yeah, that's right. You said you initially put it in the good if true file, which for journalists is the, sounds like something could almost be too good to be true. Why were you so suspicious of each other? Why was he so suspicious of you and you of him?
Well, I'm always suspicious when someone drops into my inbox out of nowhere and offers a fantastic, amazing scoop, especially if it has to do with a secret plot involving the intelligence agencies. I've just had in my career many people who are senses that, you know, they think the government is talking to a radio in their teeth, or they are just mistaken about something, or they've read something on an opinion blog and think they're an expert. You know, and I've had sophisticated frauds who came to me with something that looked quite a lot like a government document but wasn't. So I assumed that the odds this was a real tipster, a real story, were low at the beginning. And he was suspicious because of one particular story, which is that the New York Times knew about warrantless surveillance under the Bush-Cheney administration in 2004 and didn't publish it until 2005. And he was afraid the Washington Post would do something like that.
Let's pause here for a second and have you remind everybody what the biggest revelations were. And we can get into them more in detail later, but what was learned from the trove of documents that Snowden shared with you?
So big picture, what was learned was that after 9/11, the boundaries of what the intelligence community could do, and the NSA in particular, had shifted in secret, that the rules had changed and no one had told the American people. And the rules had changed in such a way that the protections of civil liberties of Americans had been compromised. And there had been no public debate about that. It was all done inside the classified precincts. So there were programs that were revealed that took place on American soil, and that was the collection of all the call records of all American phone calls, all the who you dialed and when you dialed and how long you talked. Essentially, the building of a gigantic social network that's quite revealing about everyone and their relation to everyone else. And then there was the large-scale vacuuming up of content from big internet companies, including Facebook, including Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and so on. And then there was the bulk collection, the high volume, let's take everything on this giant pipe collection that was taking place overseas, and the implications that had for Americans. Because it's no longer true that if you collect something overseas, you're collecting on foreigners. Your email to your best friend on the next block is likely to end up in Singapore or Bogota, because these are gigantic global infrastructures that run communications on the internet.
So it was a radical reshaping of what we all and the public understood to be how surveillance, national security surveillance worked. You ultimately decided to bring it to the Post, to the Washington Post, which is where we worked together. But first, you describe in some detail how you were trying to figure out where to go with it at the time, and that you took it initially to Time Magazine. Take us back to that moment, and when you first started to go with another publication, and why you ultimately didn't go with them.
So I was a fellow, and still am a fellow, at the Century Foundation in New York. And I should add, because my bosses would like it if I add that I am now staff writer at The Atlantic. I was affiliated with Time Magazine at the time. I was, in fact, working on a cover story about privacy and surveillance in the commercial sector when Snowden kind of dropped into my inbox in the form of this Virax character. I did not want to be freelance Bart with a story of this magnitude. When I realized how big a story this was and how much information I had been expecting over a course of weeks of conversation with Snowden that we were talking about one document, that he was going to give me one document. And then 50,000 turned up, and I was stunned. And I needed the resources of a big news organization legally and editorially, and just to help me think it through. So I went to Time and asked if they had any appetite for this story. And the fact that the documents were classified was too much for them to swallow. The editorial side, the editors, the one journalist who was drawn into the conversation, and the one editor were very eager to do it. But Time Inc. Kicked it up to Time Warner, which appointed a lawyer who told me that I was not allowed to talk to my sources or my editors about the story because it was classified, and that only he, the lawyer, would talk to appropriate government contacts and tell us what we could publish. And so that was a complete wildly out of the realm of possibility deal breaker. So I had to leave. And that's when I came to the Washington Post, which was my alma mater.
It was. It was. You'd been there for quite some time before you left. So now, when you came to the Post, it was a kind of comical request that you made of Marty Baron and the senior leadership. Describe that for us.
Yeah, I had sort of rehearsed it all. At least I'd written down a bunch of things that I wanted to say on this legal pad that was a mess of scratch outs and arrows and, you know, stars and check marks. And the message was, I have a very sensitive story about national security. And before I talk about it, you know, I want to say that we can't handle this in any kind of a normal way, because the material is so sensitive. We've never before had in our possession a contemporary code word classified document, as far as I'm aware. And now, I haven't told him this yet, but we've got tens of thousands. And I said there are things in there that I'm quite sure should never be published, and that I won't agree to publish. And there are things in there that I think are essential. And we have to protect it. So we're going to need a safe and a computer with networking gear stripped out of it, encryption key cards that are kept separate from the documents themselves, and a locked room with video surveillance and all this sort of thing. And by the way, before we start this conversation, could everyone please leave their cell phone outside the room? And it sounded crazier and crazier the more I said it. These were all precautions that I was taking myself by this time, and that I felt sure were necessary. But I'm talking to a guy who is the editor of one of the great journalistic institutions in the country, who's never met me before, knows very little about me, and I'm telling him where he can put his cell phone and where he has to, you know how everyone has to encryption, and I thought he was going to throw me out.
And he didn't, and
He
it was
didn't.
to his and everyone's relief and to our benefit at the Post that he didn't. Now, when you first got set up at the Post, you were they tried to put you in a room that had a window. Tell us about that room, and then you ultimately wound up.
Well, they were very proud of themselves because they'd found a room on a secure floor with, and they changed the lock to make it a special security lock, and they had done the thing with the computers. They'd stripped out the networking hardware, but and it was in a place of honor. It was actually right next to the company president's office, which was a big vote of confidence, and I appreciated the effort, but you can't have windows in a room where you're going to keep highly classified information and where you're going to open it, because the signals from the monitor go out the window and can be picked up. And if you turned your head in the right direction from that window, you could see the Russian ambassador's residence half a block away. So it just seemed like a bad place to do this work. And I asked if I could pretty please have a different room, maybe in the basement somewhere.
Which is where we all wound up. Yeah, I will say we all thought, and you actually use this phrase in your book too to describe yourself. We did think you were in tinfoil hat territory, and nobody at the Post was prepared to do some of the computer legwork and the technical legwork that sifting through all of this required. Let's bring it back to Snowden for just a second, though. So he's given you this incredible trove. You have found a journalistic home for it. You've got everybody removing practically all their clothing before they're allowed into an air-gapped room that you work on. Were you still in touch with him in these early days? How was the communication going?
In the early days, I was in touch with him daily. We would use an encrypted form of live chat. So it would be Virax on one side and whatever name I was calling myself on another, and we were bouncing the signals through Romania and Czech Republic or something. The anonymizing software was making it hard to trace who was talking to whom, and the encryption was making it hard to see what we were saying. But yeah, I was in touch with him regularly.
Did you know who he was at this point?
I knew who he was the day that he supplied the first document. The first document was accompanied by 2 notes to me and Laura Poitras. They're called "Read Me First" and "Read Me Second." And at the bottom of the first one was his full name, social security number, CIA employee number from when he had been working there, and so on. So that was the first moment I knew who he was. And until I looked up his date of birth, when I was astonished to find he was 29 years old, I had assumed I was talking to someone rather more advanced in his career.
As a reminder to everyone, we're talking here to Bart Gellman about his new book, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. You did, though, ultimately have a fairly complex relationship with Snowden. At one point, he stopped talking to you for several months. Tell us about that relationship. What was that back and forth like?
Well, he was of mixed minds about dealing with someone from the mainstream media at all. He felt like it would legitimate the story and it would give heft and weight to the stories that he wanted written about, to the issue that he wanted debated. But he was really looking for advocates. And he found those in Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald. They were full-throatedly on his side in his defense, and sort of placed themselves in opposition to the surveillance state, especially Greenwald. And I didn't do that. I mean, he said to me once, "I don't think I could ever trust you to watch my back." but I trust you to report. And I thought, good, that's about where things should be. You can trust that I will report. You can trust that I will keep your name confidential as long as you want it to be confidential. But other than that, my job is to tell the truth and to find out what I can find out. And I pushed him on personal matters because people wanted to know, who was this guy? Why did he do what he did? How did he do what he did? What were his attitudes? What was the impact on him of all this? I went to visit him in Russia, expecting to find a guy who had found his life had sort of collapsed around him, and he could no longer travel. He could no longer see his family. His girlfriend was still back home. I thought I might see someone who was having, if not second thoughts, at least, understood the costs that he'd borne. And I found instead someone who was happy with his lot in life. He was Zen-like and satisfied that he had done what he set out to do.
I remember when you called me to say that you were going to Moscow, but that I couldn't tell anybody. But that you felt that you needed to tell someone, you needed to tell an editor at the Post. And I remember sitting on that knowledge and being so very worried about you, given that here was probably the most sought after, famous fugitive in the world that you were going to go visit. We've touched on your personal security. Let's skip ahead chronologically, and I want to hear a little bit about what you did when you went to Moscow. How did you take the precautions necessary to go meet with him?
Well, I wanted to go and meet with him. I wanted to talk to him about his life and about how he had done what he did, because the story of, how this guy make off with the patrimony of the surveillance state, under the nose of the world's most capable surveillance agency, that was a big story, had yet to be written. But I did not want to disclose any of my secrets, either to the US government or to the Russian government in transit. I did not bring any documents with me. I did not bring any old notes with me. I didn't even bring devices that I used for my real work. I brought travel devices that were empty. And people seem to like the cloak and dagger aspect of this. I mean, when what I was trying to figure out is, how can I take notes and recordings and photographs in Moscow and get them back to myself in New York without handing them over in transit to the Russian government or the US government. And so I would record an interview with Snowden, and then I would go immediately to take the memory card, and I would encrypt the audio and then re-encrypt it, and then load it to an anonymous server, and then to 2 more servers for redundancy. And then I cut the memory card into pieces, because when you record onto an audio recorder, that's not encrypted. And I didn't want recordings in the clear of our whole conversation to be something that, could be searched and found at the border.
And of course, you're taking all these precautions because of not just what Russians could do, but back in the US, the very surveillance state whose reach you had uncovered. What in addition to Laura Poitras, of course, having been stopped at the airports, what else did you learn about steps that the government has taken to monitor journalist activity, including yours?
Well, one of the first things I discovered as I looked through these 50,000 documents, as I looked through the Snowden archive, was I found my own name in the files, which was creepy, I have to say. And it was on a memo from the from the NSA director to the Attorney General, saying, here's a list of stories that have appeared in the news media that disclose important secrets, and we would like to see criminal investigations. And here's 3 stories from Barton Gellman. And so there's almost like a gasp when you see your name on the screen in a memo like that. Please go investigate Bart's story. and it had been from some years back, and I started worrying about my sources. Hi, Audrey. And I decided right then and there to do a Freedom of Information Act request for files about me, which turned out interesting things. It turned out that there was I can't remember the number of pages, but I think it was 81-page file of every international trip I'd ever taken, since sort of since birth, I think, just about. There, you know, there was a lot of talk about investigations involving my work. I mean, look, if you have a whole lot of secrets in a pile and the world knows you're not just going to make them public, then you've got a big target painted on your back. And so I was the subject of hacking attempts from more than one country. Google notified me that state-sponsored attackers were trying to break into my devices and my accounts. My iPad was hacked right in front of my eyes. The screen gutted out, and Linux commands started scrolling across from bottom to top, saying that it was dumping the operating system and loading a new kernel and so forth. You know, the list went on and on.
Yes. As a reminder, everyone, I'm talking to Bart Gellman about his new book, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. Please send in news online if you can, and I'll ask them for you. In fact, I do have a few that have come in. We're here in Silicon Valley. I'm here in Silicon Valley. You're in New York. And so I have to ask you about the role of the technology companies in the original revelations. Some were complicit and aware and knew the role that they were playing. Others did not. And you write about both of those instances. Remind everybody about the role of the technology companies in these programs that you discovered. And also, if you could, talk a little bit about what has changed since then.
So one of the first disclosures, the first one I wrote about, was a program called PRISM. And under this program, the US government had dispensed with the previous requirement for an individual warrant under the Fourth Amendment for every search. And so they were now searching on the order of 100,000 accounts at once on Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Hotmail, as it was then called, and others. And in these cases, the government went secretly to the companies and said, give us this data. And the companies had to comply. They weren't generally fighting it very hard. There were some occasional pushbacks in the classified courtrooms where no one even knew that the cases existed. But generally speaking, the companies went along. What they didn't know about and didn't go along with, and were very unhappy to discover, was that the NSA was breaking into their infrastructure overseas. So it was allowed to go, according to this secret law, it was allowed to go to the companies and say, give us all the information you have on Anne Kornblut, if Anne is not an American. But it was going overseas and breaking into the fiber optic cables that linked data centers in overseas points. So, for example, the ones we knew for sure were Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft. They have these enormous data centers around the world. Each one is like a castle with its own power plant and sort of, walls and biometric sensors and, gigantic sort of, acres of servers in a server farm. And they're connected by fiber optic cable that is private to that company. It's either owned or leased. And they were breaking into the fiber optic links and just helping themselves. And when the companies found that out, that's when the relationship changed. And that's when all the companies began to move rapidly toward encryption. They encrypted just about every connection from their servers to your device, and they encrypted the connections between their data centers that had not previously been encrypted. And so the internet today looks very different than it did before the Snowden revelations. It's one of the biggest impacts he's had, is that when you travel around the web now, there's almost always going to be a little lock icon in your browser address bar, because almost all sites now support HTTPS. And that's literally because of the Snowden revelations and the actions that the companies took when they found out that the NSA was collecting from them in bulk.
And a lot of other changes have taken place as well. I will say, at the time that you received all the documents and started writing these stories, there was a lot of wrestling that went on about what you would publish and what you would not publish from your own standpoint before ever making a call to the government to share, to get their input on the stories. Talk a bit about why you knew from the beginning, and Snowden knew as well, there were things he had sent you that would not see the light of day, but that he sent them to you anyway.
Right. So let's just go back to that first document, the PRISM document. It's a 41-page slideshow with 7,000 words of speaker's notes. And it's an overview of the program. It describes important newsworthy features of this program that nobody knew about, that the NSA didn't used to be able to do, and now it could, and the changes that happened in secret. It also gave examples. It said, for example, here we're spying on this bad guy with photograph and name and place and date, and we're discovering this plot using this technique. Here we are learning something about a WMD program in another country that they think we don't know. I'm not going to publish those things. Those are legitimate adversaries by anyone's reckoning. If you believe in the idea that there should be any intelligence at all, these would be appropriate targets. And if I publish them, then those operations would end. That would be the end of it. We would no longer be watching this one and that one as their plots went by. And I had no interest in publishing those stories, and so I didn't even consider it. I didn't ask the government. You and I had these conversations. I had these conversations with Marty Baron, the editor of the paper, and we all agreed that there were lines we were going to draw ourselves before we even discussed it with the government. Now, why did Snowden give it to me anyway? If he had redacted that document, it would have been much harder for me to trust it. If he had said, look at these inflammatory details, look at this amazing scandalous behavior, but you can't see anything on these pages because I've blacked them out for you, I would be thinking, what do they say? What if they say, well, of course we would never do this or that? Do they have important hedges? Do they describe precautions and civil liberties protections that I'm not aware of? So he felt that he had to show me, and I, as a reporter, was glad to see things, even if I wasn't going to publish them, because they were context. And by the way, knowing that this program had obtained valuable intelligence was useful context, and it was something that I said in my stories. It's not that the NSA wants to spy on every American and dig into our private affairs for no reason, and it's not that these programs are all useless. I never wrote or said that, and it was important to know that they had some value as well.
And of course, that's the very reason that you got such fierce blowback from the intelligence community once the stories started to publish. You write about being disinvited in future years to the Aspen Security Forum after attending the year that the stories broke. We got a question from somebody who's watching who asked, you say you believe Snowden did more good than harm with the revolutions, and that the intelligence community did not agree with that. Talk about that, please.
Sure. There are lots of times in any society we have trade-offs that we have to work through. So coronavirus it's a suppression of the disease versus destruction of the economy. At least that's the way it's often portrayed. In these cases, there were several kinds of trade-offs. One was a trade-off in security, which is that if you have an agency that is relying upon and exploiting holes in the security of the internet, then it is not the only one that is exploiting those. Then other countries and criminals and hackers can get into your stuff. And so having an unencrypted internet is not a good thing for Americans in their economic affairs or their personal affairs, just because it might be a good thing for the NSA when it's doing its intelligence gathering. That there's a trade-off there. There's also a trade-off in any democracy between self-government and self-defense. If all you care about is the national security, if that's your sole criterion, then you would probably keep more secrets. But if we don't know as a people, then we can't hold our government accountable for what it's doing. So if we know the problem is, then everybody knows. So there is a tension here between these two sort of organizing principles of self-government and self-defense. And so I thought that Snowden made possible an absolutely vital debate, which most of the government officials now also agree was a vital debate. You just wish it had happened some other way. And I would be happy to argue that there was no other way for it to happen.
So, well, of course, and one of their chief arguments at the time was that there were checks and balances. The public just didn't know about them, that they had norms, they had checks in place, they had the FISA court, and that they were able to use good sense and use their judgment in exercising this program. We're in a new administration now from the time when the stories were written. What has the change of opinion been among these officials now under President Trump?
So one of the things I do in the book is I sit down and have long conversations, with these people who used to talk to me and then ostracized me for years and then gradually started talking to me again. And so, for example, I go to a CIA hangout diner in Northern Virginia and meet Jim Clapper for a breakfast that ends up lasting 3 hours. He was the former director of national intelligence, recently retired. And we look for whatever meeting of minds we can find about the Snowden story and talk through some of the harder questions. And one of the things that impressed me was that Clapper said we did need to have this debate. We were keeping too many secrets. And he said it's possible that that we're doing too much surveillance. I asked him the question, you trusted yourself, you trusted the checks and balances when you were running the place, and you trusted the presidents you worked for, and you trusted the workforce. But what happens when you have a president who comes in who does not respect the law, who does not respect norms, who has a track record of suborning his subordinates, bringing them into behavior that they would never have imagined they'd done before? Is it possible that some of the machinery that you've built for surveillance is just too powerful for a democracy to want to have? And he said that that's a question he never would have asked himself before, but he does ask himself now. It's a fascinating conversation. He also gets pissed off at me and scolds me from time to time. So it's all there.
Leaking secrets still not in their DNA. Edward Snowden, of course, now lives in Moscow. Can you talk about him as a person? What's he like as a source, as a person? He's obviously got a tremendous number of quirks.
He is. So he's an autodidact. He learns what he wants to learn, and he doesn't bother with things that don't interest him. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met, and he's widely read. He's preternaturally articulate. He's zealous in his beliefs. quite sure of himself. He's got firm opinions about what matters in the world and what doesn't matter. He's not interested in talking about his personal life very much. He could be a scold and sort of just, you know, a handful to try to deal with as a reporter. And so we had a turbulent relationship that went back and forth. He would say I wasn't doing enough of this or I was doing too much of that. And I would say, well, why won't you answer the question? And he would say, you shouldn't even be asking the question. And, you know, I mean, the thing is, so much of our interaction happened on screen that I'm able to show it to you verbatim in these scenes. You know, if we're having an argument, you get to see it. You know, all the words of it. My interviews with him were all recorded and transcribed. So I can take you to these moments and show you what was going on, and you get to form an impression of Snowden for yourself.
As a reminder, talking to Bart Gellman about his new book, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. We have some more questions from viewers. With a change of administration, is there a chance for Snowden to return to the US and face trial?
Well, that would not be a chance he would enjoy taking. Donald Trump is on record saying that he should be executed. And there were friends of Snowden who worried that with Trump's arrival in office and his friendly relationship with Putin, that Putin would make a gift of him, that Putin would just hand over Snowden. That didn't happen. And right now, I don't see anything immediately likely to disturb the status quo. It suits Putin just fine to have Snowden there as a kind of a propaganda talking point. You know, we've got a political dissident from U.S. oppression here that we're protecting with political asylum. The U.S. government is not going to offer Snowden a favorable deal, and Snowden is not going to come back for a trial on espionage when the sole elements of the charge are that he had possession of classified material and gave it to someone who was not entitled. That's the whole charge. There's no public interest defense. He can't say why he thought it was essential for the public to know all this. And in fact, if it were true that every single program, and it's not true, but if it were true, every single program that Snowden disclosed was subsequently found to be unconstitutional, he would still be guilty of espionage. And so he's not eager to come back and face those charges.
Do you talk to him regularly now?
I talk to him occasionally now.
How's he doing?
I mean, he's in a stable life. He's got a job as head of a U.S. NGO, the Freedom of the Press Foundation. He is on the lecture circuit. He gives a lot of paid talks. He wrote a successful book this past fall that was published this past fall. His girlfriend moved to Moscow and they got married. He's in it for the long haul now.
He also wrote a book himself, and Glenn Greenwald wrote a book, and Laura Poitras made a documentary. What more did you feel there was to tell?
Well, first of all, there was a story of investigative journalism, how this story was done. I mean, I try in Dark Mirror, even to my sometimes embarrassment, to let you see scene by scene how the story developed and the hard decisions we were making and the screw ups I made, and the debates we had inside the newsroom. So there's one story about, you know, how do you authenticate and report about a leak on this scale? There's another story, is the untold story of how Snowden actually did what he did. How did he sneak through the NSA systems and extract all these secrets and get away with it? I'm able to solve a lot of that mystery. And then there's the story of what the NSA programs themselves were in some kind of context. I was always frustrated, and you know this because you edited so many of the stories. I felt when I was writing these stories for the newsroom with my colleagues, and we're pretty good at what we do. We know how to speak English. I felt like the stories were always so hard to follow because they were newsy and it's a complicated subject. And in narrative form, with characters and events and the ability to write with a little bit more breathing room, I feel like I could explain what was going on and why you should care about it in a way that I never quite managed in the newspaper. I think investigative reporting is still quite healthy in this country. I think you're seeing an amazing amount of it happening uh, at many great news organizations, some old, some new. But that doesn't mean the government is making it easy or not trying to stop it. Under the Obama administration, there were more prosecutions of journalistic sources than there ever had been before. In fact, there were more during the Obama administration than all previous governments combined. And so if someone is a confidential source for a reporter and spills a secret, that person gets prosecuted. There had never been a charge of espionage against a reporter for writing a story. It was something that our lawyers talked about during the Snowden affair. There was a risk that I could be charged with espionage just for publishing. But it's also, there's a strong case to be made that that would be unconstitutional, and that if you read the Espionage Act to allow for that prosecution, then the law should be struck down. But the Trump administration has decided to test that. They have indicted Julian Assange on a wide range of counts. And I'm not saying that Assange is exactly like a journalist. But what I am saying is that on 3 of the counts that they've charged against Assange, the crime alleged is that he took a secret and he published it for all the world to see. Those are the words. And that's the sole element of the crime, that it's espionage by publication. If that's allowed to stand, if he's convicted on that and an appeal fails, then there is a precedent that would apply exactly equally to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, or anybody else.
Another journalism question from the audience. With the high level of government surveillance the U.S. was conducting, how can journalists assure anonymous sources they will remain anonymous? What tools or strategies can journalists use?
Well, this is something that I've thought a lot about, and the profession of journalism has thought a lot about in recent years. I was considered a bit of a crank, I think, back in 2013 for the precautions I was taking, but they're much more common now. I mean, many journalists are using encryption now and publishing keys that would allow other people to communicate with them privately. There's much better and easier technology available now. So, for example, for text messaging, an app called Signal is made by, absolutely state-of-the-art cryptography, and they don't store any information on their servers to know who's talking to whom or what they're saying. So, that's a good way to talk. On my website, bartongelman.com/contact. I offer a variety of ways of coming to me, including a very, very secure one called Secure Drop, which I know the Washington Post also has an instance of that running now. There's I mean, you can use mail. Mail is not opened without a warrant. The outside of the envelope might be scanned. So you might not want to put your return address if you're writing to a reporter with some kind of a secret, but nobody's looking at the inside of the envelope. I'm meeting people in person, things like that. But I mean, it requires thinking through, and I think more sources are willing to think this through with journalists when we work together. But it's also the case that if the government decides to put, sort of the full power of the state into an investigation, then there is going to be a significant risk that they'll find what they're trying to look for.
number of people are asking about whistleblowers. I'm going to ask this one here. Let's see. How do we message to the general public that this sort of whistleblowing charity?
I'm sorry, you on my end, you were breaking up a little bit.
Oh, okay. I'll read it again. How do we amplify the message to the general public that this sort of whistleblowing should be encouraged and not authoritatively suppressed in the guise of national security?
The thing is, I think the public understands at some level that there are big, important stories. There are things that they want to know about that powerful institutions suppress, and that sometimes you can't find them out without whistleblowers. I mean, whistleblowers brought some of the major evidence into the public sphere about the health dangers of smoking. Whistleblowers told us about CIA torture and secret prisons and secret warrantless surveillance. Ask yourself whether you would not want to know that the US government had performed human experiments on its own soldiers to try to find out how nuclear radiation affects the human body. Should we really keep that secret? I think that most people think of something that they found out about the government that they would not want the government to be able to suppress. And I think maybe just using examples is the best way to do it.
Someone else asks, we've seen multiple whistleblowers and anonymous sources in the Trump administration. If you had to predict, and I know you don't like to predict, but I'm going to ask it anyway, if you had to predict who would be the next Snowden, which agency and what type of intelligence would be revealed?
Wow. If I answered that question, and if you could commoditize my answer, you should go right out and sell it short. Because my crystal ball's terrible. That's a very specific question. But I will expect that there will be revelations and disclosures about the spending of on the current economic stimulus spending. There's so much money being thrown out so fast at so many people with so little oversight that there will be scandals and self-dealing discovered, and some of that will be from whistleblowers.
Let me ask that person's question a slightly different way, which is to say, what do we know about the Trump administration's approach to surveillance specifically? Obviously, there was some government reforms, which you should talk about after Snowden. Where's the Trump administration on this whole issue? What do we know about what the NSA has been up to?
Well, it's really interesting because you have a president who, on this issue, as on so many other issues, is all over the map and changing his mind from day to day, depending on what he's thinking about. You can't really talk about the administration without talking about the president because it doesn't represent him. So the administration position was that it wanted to renew 3 expiring authorities under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. They expired in February. But Trump started tweeting that he was against it because he's convinced that the whole sort of deep state was spying on him, or I don't know whether he's actually convinced of it, but he says it. And so FISA became a bad thing. So the Justice Department made its position known in Congress, and then Trump reversed it. On the other hand, Trump has a habit of projecting. So when he accuses people of things, it's often because he's already been accused of it, or he's already done it. So when he's so obsessed with the idea of surveilling political enemies that I wouldn't be stunned to learn that he'd made a few efforts in those directions himself. We'll have to find out.
Bart Gellman's new book is Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State. In the few minutes that we have left, a lot of what's in this book is so personal, which is not always the way historically that you write. Why, in this instance, did you feel that you wanted to share more about your own journey, if we could call it that, through the Snowden documents? And were there elements of what was so personal that were hard for you to write?
Yeah, look, I mean, in the course of this story, this character named Gelman is lost some of the time and anxious and worried and unsure what to do and makes mistakes. And I feel like it was an integral part of the story to kind of part the curtains and show what was really going on. That because so much of this is a relationship story, it's a relationship between source and reporter, between reporter and someone who is both a source and a subject. That I could not honestly leave myself out of it, and I've received a lot of questions over the years about, you know, what it was like to deal with Snowden, what it was like to deal with the U.S. government when they didn't want something published, how I protected myself, you know, what kind of hacking efforts were made against me, those sort of things. They all seemed like they were part of the storyline of this book, and I very reluctantly came to the conclusion that I should be writing about those things too.
This is obviously not your first national security scoop or even book. You wrote extensively about Dick Cheney in the past. What were the distinct hallmarks about Snowden as you take a step back and look at the entirety of that work and your whole body of work? What made this stand out, other than, I would imagine, the sheer volume of the documents that he delivered to you?
And it was both sensitivity and volume. I don't really know how to explain this, but the the course of normal action for a national security reporter is you're going to find out some things that are classified, because it's hard about anything to do with foreign policy or defense or intelligence that doesn't touch on something that someone has put a stamp on somewhere. But it's not normal for a newspaper reporter to get the full copy of a document that has compartmented stamps on it, and that document was dated last month. And that's what happened with Snowden. There were a boatload of contemporary code word classified documents, meaning above top secret, and that just created a mass of its own. It created an obligation to protect the material. It made me and the Post hacking targets. It created dilemmas. I mean, I knew that there were potentially significant consequences from some of the stories, but I also knew that it might be that the U.S. government would lose some collection opportunities, that there would be damage that I wouldn't actually think is allowed to be called damage in a story like this because of the two conflicting imperatives I talked about earlier. So if Google finds out that the government is breaking into its infrastructure and then decides to encrypt the links afterward because its customers are angry and worried about their privacy and security, that is the free market and a democratic society functioning as intended. That's the people not liking what the government's doing and making them stop it. So that some of the damage that people allege on these stories was really the proper functioning of our most important institutions.
What other fallout have you seen since the revelations themselves? You obviously had time in doing the book to look at what impact the stories had and to reassess the material that you had. What other fallout have you seen, either for better or for worse?
So there have been a lot of legal challenges that are proceeding further along in courts than they would have before. Anybody who tried to challenge secret surveillance in the past has run into either a jurisdiction problem because it took place overseas and U.S. courts didn't have the jurisdiction, or a standing problem, which means that you can't prove as a plaintiff that anything's happened to you because it's a secret. And so the judge says you have no standing to challenge the government program because you can't prove that you personally were affected by it. Now, because of the Snowden leaks, there were a lot of things that happened that reduced the jurisdictional and standing problems. And so you have lawsuits proceeding and legal challenges that take place in open courts and not in secret courts. There's legislation. There was the USA Freedom Act, which was passed in response to the Snowden disclosures that closely restricted one of the NSA programs, the one that collected the call records, and that one had a sunset provision and is now expired. So, I mean, the idea that big surveillance authorities in the past would have expired without being renewed would have been highly improbable. But the new political culture around surveillance and privacy makes it possible.
In the event that there are future leakers listening at the moment, what are the areas of interest, of reporting interest, that you have at the moment?
Well, what I'm interested in as a reporter myself right now is voting and voting rights, and I'm going to be doing a piece before the election on all the hijinks that people get up to trying to interfere with people's voting rights and trying to skew the count. And I'm especially interested in links between the pandemic and the debates over voting.
Great. Well, like I say, I hope there will be future whistleblowers who will now reach out to you with what they know, and I'm sure they will, given your track record. Thank you so much. A huge thank you to Bart Gellman. We want to remind everyone that you can get a copy of Mr. Gellman's book, Dark Mirror, Edward Snowden and the American Surveillance State, by visiting your local bookstore. We're also very thankful to all of our viewers and listeners online. As noted earlier, the Commonwealth Club will continue to provide virtual programming in the days ahead. Please visit the club regularly at commonwealthclub.org to learn more and donate. I'm Ann Kornblut, and now this virtual program of the Commonwealth Club is adjourned.